Daniel chapter 5 today. How many of you have heard the phrase, the handwriting is on the wall? It usually means that something bad is about to happen and that your fate has been sealed. Well, that phrase actually comes from Daniel 5. The year is 539 BC. It's been nearly 70 years since Daniel and his friends were brought in chains to Babylon. Daniel is an old man now. He's well over 80. Nebuchadnezzar, the original Babylonian king who brought them there and who became Daniel's friend, is dead. He's been dead for about 23 years, scholars say at this point. And Belshazzar, his uber-privileged, spoiled grandson, is now sitting on the throne of Babylon. As chapter 5 opens, King Belshazzar, is hosting a party, an all-out rager in our terms. We know that, by the way, because in verse 1, it says that they were serving wine at the party, and the Aramaic word for wine literally means lots of wine. In Hebrew, 100 kegger is how you would translate that. Well, suddenly, as they're drinking and toasting and playing beer pong, a mysterious floating hand appears and begins to carve a message into the plaster on the wall. Now, talk about terrifying. I mean, imagine what this would have been like. You're at a party, and suddenly a severed floating hand appears that everybody sees and begins etching three mysterious words into the wall, pressing into the rock, pieces of rock and plaster flying everywhere. And then, after completing this mysterious message, the hand just disappears. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. The three words mean numbered, weighed, and divided. That's all it says. Well, as you can imagine, people start screaming and the party descends into chaos. The Babylonian wise men are all summoned and none of them can tell the king what it means. When suddenly the elderly queen, who would have been Nebuchadnezzar's widow, Belshazzar's grandmother now, she says, well, I once knew a man who could interpret messages like this. And she tells them about Daniel. See, evidently Daniel was either retired from public life or he'd fallen from favor. Either way, they send for him and he comes in. He reads the message on the wall and says, verse 26, mene, mene, again, that word means numbered, means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom, Belshazzar, and brought it to an end. Verse 27, tekel, that word means weighed. And Daniel says that means that Belshazzar, you have been weighed on the balance of God's justice and you have been found deficient. You see, unlike his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar had never humbled himself before God. Verse 28, parsin. Remember, that word means divided. Daniel says that means your kingdom, Belshazzar, has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And indeed, that very night, less than 50 miles away, the army of the Medes and the Persians have converged to mount an attack against Babylon. And that very night, Babylon will be overthrown and King Belshazzar and all the royal family are going to be killed. This story is about how God ultimately brought down the prideful, rebellious, unjust Babylonian Empire, and in the process, kept his promise to restore his people to their promised land. But this story also gives us a picture of how God deals with prideful, rebellious people in all times and in all places. So I'm going to discuss four brief things in this message. Number one, partying in the face of death. Number two, the failure of our wise men. Number three, the handwriting on the wall for all of us. And then number four, how the finger of God has appeared to our generation. Okay, here we go. Number one, partying in the face of death. What is unusual about this party is that Belshazzar knew that the combined armies of the Medes and the Persians were less than 50 miles away. Everybody in Babylon knew that. So why in the face of that kind of danger would Belshazzar be throwing a party? We don't know. Maybe he was trying to put on a brave face. Maybe he was trying to inspire everyone with his brazen courage. Maybe he's trying to drown out his own fears with amusement and alcohol. Or maybe he just is so arrogant that he thinks Babylon can never fall. Belshazzar partied in the face of imminent death. Do you know that people do this today? Blaise Pascal, the famous French philosopher, said that the most consistent human reaction to our awareness of our own mortality, the fact that we're going to die, the most consistent reaction is to distract ourselves with amusement. Life, Blaise Pascal said, is like being in a stagecoach that is barreling toward the edge of a cliff. You know that the cliff is coming. You know that you're going to plunge over it and die, and you can't stop it from happening. But instead of thinking about this sure coming death that is coming for all of us and what that means for you, you distract yourself with observations about the beautiful scenery along the road and you make pleasant conversation with fellow passengers. This is insane, Pascal said. If we know death is coming, the most important question is whether or not we are ready for it. But most people go through life trying to distract themselves and pretend like what they know is coming isn't coming. Y'all listen, a new study just came out from UNC Chapel Hill that confirms that the death rate in America is holding steady at 100%. I mean, look around the room if you're in a room where you are. Look at the people that you can see. In 100 years, none of the people you're looking at are going to be here. Scripture says it is appointed unto man once to die. And after that, the judgment. Death and judgment are certain. The question is, are you ready for it? See, the only difference between Belshazzar and us is that he was told the exact day that he would die. We may not know that, but we are just as certain of that day's inevitability. It's like all of us are holding an invisible stick of dynamite in our hands, and we just don't know how long the fuse is. Are you prepared to meet God, or are you partying in the face of death, distracting yourself with amusement and friends and possessions and climbing in your career? You know, a really important moment in my own story of how I came to Jesus was a good friend of mine getting killed in a car wreck. Standing there beside his casket, which had to be closed because the wreck was so bad, it just all came into focus for me. Death, for all of us, is certain. The only thing is how long it's going to be. And the only thing that mattered to my friend anymore was whether he had been prepared to meet God. Number two, we see the failure of our wise men, partying in the face of death. Now the failure of our wise men. A repeated theme of Daniel is the failure of Babylon's wise men to provide answers when the questions really matter. Obviously, the wise men contributed something to Babylonian knowledge. Otherwise, the king would never have kept them around. But consistently, when it really mattered, when there was a life-threatening or life-defining dream or vision or question, these wise men let the king down. And each of those times, Daniel or one of his Hebrew friends appears and reveals that there is a God in heaven. Remember that phrase? There's a God in heaven who can do what the wise men are unable to do. There comes a point at which the wise men of every age and every culture fail. So let's consider who would qualify as our wise men today. Well, today we look to scientists and educators, doctors and politicians to guide us, to make society work, to provide us with answers. And while all these folks have their place and they contribute a lot to society, like Nebuchadnezzar's wise men, our wise men have proven unable to answer those questions that matter most. Where did this all come from, and where is it all going, and what's the meaning of it all? Is there hope for us when we die? Is there a God to whom we're going to be held accountable? Is there forgiveness of sins and salvation? How can we find meaning and satisfaction in life? These are life's most important questions. Just as with Babylon, when it comes to life's ultimate questions, our wise men, our Stephen Hawkings and our Steve Jobs and our political leaders on the left and right, they're unable to give us those answers that matters most. We need a word from the God of heaven. Number three, the handwriting on the wall for all of us. Mene, mene, your days are numbered. Tekel, you have been weighed on the balance of God's justice and found deficient. Parson, your kingdom has been taken from you and divided. The Bible says this will ultimately be God's verdict on all of us. Let me explain by taking a closer look at what Daniel said to Belshazzar in verse 22, chapter 5. You, Belshazzar, he says, you have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. Instead, you've exalted yourself against the Lord of the heavens. The vessels from God's house were brought to you, and as you and your nobles, wives, and concubines drank wine from them, you praised the gods that were made of silver and gold, gods which cannot see or hear or understand. And you have not glorified the God who holds your life breath in his hands and who controls the whole course of your life. Daniel charges Belshazzar with two main things. Two things that I would say are the essence of all sin, not just Belshazzar's sin, but ours too. First, he says, you've not worshiped God as God. Verse 23, you've exalted yourself against the Lord of the heavens. You've lived like you were God. You've not submitted to him and given him glory. Instead, you've lived to please yourself and worship idols of your choosing in his place. Second, he says, you took the vessels that God set apart for his purposes and you commandeered them for yours. Specifically, Daniel identifies the temple artifacts that Belshazzar is using to party. He says, you've taken the knives and the plates and the candlesticks that God intended for worship, and you've used them to throw your own personal party. These were instruments that had been consecrated to the worship of God that Belshazzar is now using to host a drunken orgy. These two elements are the essence of all sin. In fact, write it down this way. Sin A displaces God's authority in our lives with our own, and B, sin steals what God intended for his purposes and spends it on ours. And those are things we're all guilty of. All of us have displaced God's authority with our own, choosing to call the shots in our lives rather than let God do it. And all of us has taken what God gave us to glorify him with, and we've used it primarily to serve ourselves. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament says that in whatever we do, we're supposed to do all of it to the glory of God. That means anything we do is supposed to be first and foremost an act of worship, like an offering to God. And when we don't do that, we're stealing. To not use every part of our lives for God's glory is every bit as much stealing the consecrated things as what Belshazzar did. See, we're all guilty of what Belshazzar did, which leads us to our last observation, number 4, how the finger of God has appeared to our generation. See, you say, well, I'm sure that everyone would pay a lot more attention to this if a supernatural finger appeared and carved these things into a wall for us. But I'm telling you, the finger of God has appeared to this generation. How so, you say? In Jesus. In Jesus, God showed up on earth speaking and healing, and to prove he was who he said he was, he rose from the dead. And the historical evidence for that is even more compelling than a severed hand appearing at a keg party and writing a message on a wall. When Jesus was here, some of the Pharisees said, the finger of God is upon him. He was the finger of God that had come to earth. And the message that Jesus gave was just as serious as what the hand spelled out for Belshazzar. Mene, mene, your days are numbered. It is appointed unto man once to die, and after this, the judgment. Appointed means that God knows the day. Belshazzar got a rare gift. He was told the day it was going to happen. You and I may not know that, but our death is just as certain. Tekel, you've been measured on the scales of God's justice, and you and I have been found deficient. All of us, see, when weighed on the divine scales of God's perfect justice, we're all going to come up deficient. The book of Romans in the New Testament says, for all have sinned and all have fallen short of the glory of God. One day, each of us is going to give an account to an absolutely holy and perfect God who knows everything there is to know about us, all of our secrets, every stray thought, every hidden sin, every unkind thing we've ever said, every dishonest action we've ever committed. And that God will hold us accountable for it, and all of us are going to be found deficient. Friend, your days are numbered just like Belshazzar. You have been weighed in the balance and found deficient. That's the bad news. The good news is that Jesus, who explained these things to us, Jesus is the God who took your punishment for you. In the Gospel of John, Jesus said that he did not come into the world to point the finger of condemnation at us, but to have it pointed at him in our place so that he could take our punishment in our place. And that's what Jesus did for you and for me on the cross, if you're willing to receive it. If you've never received Christ, that's what you should do today. Now, let me end our time today by showing you that there's something in this story that's there to encourage us as believers, for those of you who have already received Christ. Daniel wrote this book for Israelites who were discouraged. And they were discouraged because everywhere they looked, the Babylonians were in charge, and the Babylonians seemed to get away with all kinds of blasphemy and injustice and cruelty. They seemed to sin with impunity. A lot of those Israelites, like Daniel, had lived their entire lives under captivity, and they couldn't help but wonder, is God still in charge? Is God ever going to do anything about this? We say that God rules, but look at the world we're living in. Well, see, this chapter, Daniel 5, is a resounding yes to that question. God is still in charge. The days of wickedness are numbered, and soon the true king will return. And when he does, he will restore justice to the earth and take us home soon to the promised land, just like he promised. Friend, in the same way, it's easy for you and me to get discouraged in our Babylons, isn't it? After all, it's been 2,000 years since the king was here. Is he ever coming back? This story is a resounding yes to that question. He is coming back, and he is bringing justice and salvation with him. As believers, our hope is in that day. Our hope is in that king. And that hope gives us strength to not only survive as exiles in a dark and hostile Babylon, but it's strength to shine as witnesses there as well.